The Riverside Public Library had always been my sanctuary. Tucked away on Elm Street between the old bakery and a used bookstore that hadn't changed its window display since 1987, it was the kind of place that existed outside of time. The building itself was a relic from the 1920s, all dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light that seemed to move like honey across the worn carpet. The air held that distinctive scent that only old libraries possess, a mixture of aging paper, leather bindings, and something indefinably comforting that might have been decades of quiet contemplation soaked into the very walls. I'd been coming here for 3 months now, ever since I'd moved to this sleepy college town for graduate school. While my classmates spent their free time at coffee shops or bars, I found myself drawn to the library's poetry section every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, and sometimes on Saturdays when the world felt too loud and I needed the particular kind of silence that only came from being surrounded by thousands of stories. The poetry section occupied the northeast corner of the second floor, nestled between philosophy and religion. It was a cozy alcove with just four tall shelves arranged in a square, creating an intimate space that felt separate from the rest of the library. The shelf facing the windows held the classics, Dickinson, Frost, Yeats, while the one opposite contained more contemporary works. The other two shelves housed everything in between, organized with the kind of careful attention that suggested the librarian who'd arranged them truly loved poetry. I had my routine. I'd climb the creaking wooden stairs, nod to Mrs. Henderson at the reference desk. She'd worked there for 37 years and knew every book by heart, and make my way to the poetry section. I'd always start with the contemporary shelf, running my fingers along the spines until something called to me. Then I'd find my favorite spot, the wooden chair tucked into the corner where I could see both the entrance to the section and the windows that looked out onto the maple trees lining Elm Street. It was on a Thursday in late September that I first noticed him. I was reaching for a collection of Mary Oliver's work, my fingers just grazing the spine, when I heard footsteps on the carpet behind me. I turned, expecting to see Mrs. Henderson or perhaps one of the graduate students who sometimes wandered through, but instead found myself looking at someone I'd never seen before. He was tall, maybe 6'2" to my 5'10", with dark brown hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and shoulders that suggested he spent time outdoors. He wore a soft gray cardigan over dark jeans, and there was something about the way he moved through the space that suggested he belonged there, as if he'd been coming to this library far longer than I had. But it wasn't his height or his clothes that made me pause mid-reach for Mary Oliver. It was his eyes. They were the color of coffee with just a touch of cream, and they held a kind of gentle intelligence that made me think of quiet conversations by firelight. He'd stopped when he saw me, his hand hovering over the philosophy section just 10 feet away. For a moment, we simply looked at each other in the golden afternoon light that was streaming through the windows, and I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with ever having seen him before and everything to do with some deeper sense of familiarity. "Sorry," he said quietly, his voice pitched low in deference to the library's hushed atmosphere. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," I replied, realizing as I said it that I was still standing there with my hand stretched toward Mary Oliver, frozen in place like some kind of literary statue. I pulled my hand back and turned to face him properly. "Are you looking for something specific?" He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that started slow and reached his eyes, transforming his entire face. "Just browsing, actually. I have a weakness for poetry." He gestured toward the shelves around us. "This is probably my favorite section in the whole library." "Mine too," I admitted, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunlight. There's something about being surrounded by all these voices, all these different ways of seeing the world. He nodded, understanding flickering across his features. "Exactly, it's like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like having access to dozens of different lenses, you know? Each poet shows you something you might have missed." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the collected wisdom of generations of poets, and I felt the particular kind of connection that comes from finding someone who understands something you care deeply about. It was rare, that immediate sense of recognition, and I found myself reluctant to let the moment end. "I'm David, by the way," he said, taking a half step closer and extending his hand. "Marcus," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was warm and firm, and I noticed he had paint under his fingernails, just a trace of blue that suggested he was an artist of some kind. "It's nice to meet you, Marcus." The way he said my name with careful attention to each syllable made something flutter in my stomach. "I have a feeling I'll be seeing you around here." He was right, though I didn't know it then. The next Tuesday, I climbed the familiar stairs and made my way to the poetry section, trying to tell myself that the slight quickening of my pulse had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing David again. I'd thought about him more than I cared to admit over the weekend. The way his eyes had lit up when we talked about poetry, the careful way he'd moved through the space as if he didn't want to disturb the quiet magic of the place. I was browsing the contemporary section, letting my eyes wander over familiar names, when I heard those same footsteps on the carpet behind me. My heart did a small somersault as I turned to find David approaching the classic shelf, wearing the same gray cardigan but with a white t-shirt underneath this time. He looked up and caught my eye, that slow smile spreading across his face again. "We meet again," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, a note of pleasure maybe, or recognition, that made my chest tighten in the best possible way. "Seems like we have similar schedules," I replied, trying for casual and probably failing. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons?" "Guilty as charged." He pulled a slim volume from the shelf, Neruda, I noticed, and turned it over in his hands. "I teach a morning painting class at the community college, so my afternoons are usually free." So he was an artist. That explained the paint under his fingernails, and suddenly I could picture him in front of an easel, his brow furrowed in concentration, those careful hands creating something beautiful. "What do you teach?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Watercolor, mostly, some acrylic for the braver souls." He opened the Neruda and read a few lines, his lips moving silently with the Spanish. "There's something about the unpredictability of watercolor that reminds me of poetry, actually. You can plan all you want, but sometimes the paint, or the words, take you somewhere completely unexpected." I found myself smiling at the comparison. I like that. The idea that art has its own agenda. "Exactly." He looked up from the book, meeting my eyes directly. "What about you? Are you a student?" "Graduate student," I confirmed. "English literature focusing on contemporary American poetry." His eyebrows rose with interest. "No kidding. So you're studying what I just dabble in." "I don't know about that. You seem to know your way around these shelves pretty well." We fell into an easy conversation about poetry and art, about the ways creative expression could surprise you. David had strong opinions about the connection between visual art and written word, and I found myself drawn into the kind of discussion I rarely had with my fellow graduate students, who approached literature with more academic rigor than genuine passion. As we talked, I became increasingly aware of the space between us, how we'd unconsciously moved closer as the conversation deepened, until we were standing perhaps 3 feet apart in the narrow aisle between the shelves. I could smell his cologne, something clean and subtle, and I noticed the way his hands moved when he talked, expressive and graceful. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson's announcement that the library would be closing in 15 minutes. I glanced at my watch, surprised to find that we'd been talking for over an hour. "Time flies," David said, echoing my thoughts. He slid the Neruda back onto the shelf with obvious reluctance. "I should probably head out." "Me too," I agreed, though I made no immediate move to leave. We walked toward the stairs together, and as we descended, I found myself hoping he'd suggest getting coffee or continuing our conversation elsewhere. But when we reached the main floor, he simply turned to me with that same warm smile. "See you Thursday?" he asked, and there was something almost hopeful in his tone. "Definitely," I replied, perhaps a little too quickly. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I found myself thinking about David at odd moments, while reading Adrienne Rich for my seminar, while walking across campus, while lying in bed at night. I replayed our conversation, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning, feeling like a teenager with a crush, which, I supposed, wasn't entirely inaccurate. When Thursday afternoon arrived, I climbed the library stairs with an anticipation I hadn't felt in months. The poetry section was empty when I arrived, and I felt a stab of disappointment. Maybe David had been just being polite when he'd suggested he'd see me again. Maybe our conversation hadn't meant as much to him as it had to me. I was browsing half-heartedly through a collection of James Wright when I heard his footsteps. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain focused on the book in my hands, not wanting to seem too eager. "Good book," David said, appearing beside me. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Wright is incredible," I agreed, looking up to meet his eyes. The way he finds transcendence in ordinary moments. "Like this one?" David asked, and there was something in his voice, a layer of meaning that had nothing to do with poetry and everything to do with the charged space between us. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Maybe. This time our conversation ranged beyond poetry. David told me about his students, about the way their faces lit up when they discovered they could create something beautiful with their own hands. I found myself sharing stories from my childhood, about the library in my hometown where I'd first discovered poetry, about the teacher who'd encouraged me to pursue graduate school. As the afternoon light shifted and deepened, casting longer shadows across the poetry section, I realized that what I was feeling went beyond simple attraction. There was something about David, the way he listened with his whole attention, the way he spoke about art and beauty with unguarded enthusiasm, that made me want to know everything about him. We were standing closer now, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that when he gestured while talking about a painting he was working on, his hand briefly touched my arm. The contact sent electricity through me, and from the way his eyes widened slightly, I thought he might have felt it too. "I should probably let you get back to your research," he said eventually, but he made no move to step away. "It can wait," I replied, meaning it completely. But then Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up from the main floor, announcing the 15-minute warning, and the spell was broken. We stepped apart reluctantly, and I felt the loss of his proximity like a physical ache. As we walked down the stairs together, I found myself memorizing details, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the sound of his quiet laughter when I made a joke about my advisor's obsession with footnotes, the gentle way he held the door for an elderly patron entering the library. "Same time next week?" he asked as we paused outside the library entrance. "I'll be there," I promised. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the library 10 minutes early, telling myself it was because I wanted to get a good parking spot. David appeared shortly after I'd settled into the poetry section, and I felt that now familiar flutter of anticipation as he approached. "You're early," he observed, settling onto the floor beside my chair with his back against the philosophy shelf. It was a more intimate arrangement than we'd managed before, and I was hyper-aware of his proximity. "So are you," I pointed out. He smiled up at me, and there was something almost shy in his expression. I was looking forward to continuing our conversation from last week. We'd been discussing the beat poets, and David had strong opinions about the intersection between their work and visual art of the same period. As we talked, I found myself studying his profile when he turned to pull books from the shelves, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyelashes caught the afternoon light. It was perhaps 40 minutes into our conversation when it happened. I was reaching for a collection of Allen Ginsberg that was shelved just above David's head, and he was simultaneously reaching up for the same book. Our hands collided in the space between us, fingers tangling briefly before we both jerked back as if we'd been burned. "Sorry," we said in unison, then laughed at our synchronicity. But the moment of contact had left me breathless. David's hand had been warm and slightly rough, painter's hands, I thought, and the brief touch had sent awareness racing through every nerve ending. "Great minds," David said softly, but his voice was slightly hoarse, and when I met his eyes, I saw something there that made my heart race. "You take it," I managed to say. "We could share it," he suggested. and there was definitely a double meaning in his words now. He opened the book between us, and suddenly we were very close, both leaning over the pages. I could feel his breath on my cheek as he read aloud from Howl, his voice pitched low and intimate in the library quiet. The words seemed to take on new meaning in his voice, and I found myself watching his lips more than following the text. When he finished reading, he looked up to find me staring at him. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, and I felt as though we were balanced on the edge of something significant. The air between us seemed charged with possibility, and I had the wild thought that he might be about to kiss me right there in the poetry section of the Riverside Public Library. Instead, he cleared his throat softly and closed the book. Ginsberg always was good at capturing intensity, he said, but his voice was still rough around the edges. Yeah, I agreed, though I was fairly certain we weren't talking about poetry anymore. That Thursday, our usual positions had shifted again. I arrived to find David already in the poetry section, standing in front of the contemporary shelf with his back to me. He was wearing a navy blue sweater that highlighted the breadth of his shoulders, and I took a moment to simply appreciate the view before announcing my presence. "Find anything good?" I asked, approaching to stand beside him. He turned to me with that warm smile that had become so familiar. "Actually, yes. I was hoping you'd help me decide between these two." He held up two collections, one by Ocean Vuong, the other by Richard Siken. Both excellent choices and both poets who wrote with unflinching honesty about desire and identity. "That's a tough choice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're both incredible, but in very different ways." "How so?" I took the Ocean Vuong from his hands, my fingers brushing his as I did so. Vuong writes about love and loss with this incredible delicacy. There's beauty in his pain, if that makes sense, like he's finding light in the darkest places. David nodded thoughtfully. "And Siken?" I took the Richard Siken collection, noting how David's eyes followed my movements. Siken is more raw. His poems about desire are visceral, almost desperate. Beautiful, but in a completely different way. "Show me," David said quietly. I opened the Siken to one of my favorite pieces and read a few lines aloud, very conscious of David's attention focused entirely on me. When I finished, I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your voice changes when you read poetry," he observed. "Does it?" "It gets softer, more intimate." The word intimate hung between us, loaded with possibility. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I didn't look away from his gaze. "Maybe it's just that poetry demands intimacy," I said. "You can't read it properly without letting it touch something inside you." "I think you're right," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. We were standing very close now, the two books held between us like a bridge. I could see the way his pulse was beating in his throat, could feel the heat radiating from his body. If I moved just slightly closer, a crash echoed through the library as someone dropped what sounded like an entire stack of books somewhere on the main floor. The sound shattered the moment like glass, and we both stepped back instinctively. "Sounds like someone had an accident," David said, but his voice was shaky. "Yeah," I agreed, though my heart was still racing from our nearness. We spent the rest of the afternoon reading quietly, sitting closer than strictly necessary in my corner spot. David had chosen a chair from the nearby table, positioning it so our knees nearly touched. Every so often, one of us would share a particularly striking line or image, and these small exchanges felt charged with the tension that had been building between us over the weeks. As closing time approached, I found myself dreading David's departure more than usual. Our encounters had taken on a rhythm that had become essential to my week, and I realized I was developing feelings that went far beyond casual attraction. "I should probably head out," David said as Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up the stairs, but he made no immediate move to leave. "Me too," I replied, though I remained seated. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I had the sense that we were both waiting for something, for one of us to be brave enough to suggest extending our time together beyond the library walls. Instead, David stood and gathered the books he'd been reading. "See you Tuesday?" he asked, as he had every week. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, meaning it more than ever. The following Tuesday brought the first real cold snap of autumn. I arrived at the library to find the heat hadn't yet been adjusted for the season, and the poetry section was noticeably chilly. David appeared a few minutes after I'd settled in, wearing a thick cream-colored sweater that made his eyes look even warmer by contrast. "Bit cold up here," he observed, rubbing his hands together. "The joys of an old building," I replied. "Mrs. Henderson says they're still using the original heating system from the 1920s, David laughed. "That explains a lot." He glanced around the poetry section, noting that I'd claimed my usual corner chair. "Mind if I join you? Body heat and all that." My pulse quickened at the suggestion, innocent as it might have been. "Of course." He pulled the other chair closer to mine, closer than he'd positioned it before, and settled in beside me. Even through his thick sweater, I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and I had to resist the urge to lean into him. "Better," he said, and I wasn't sure if he meant the temperature or our proximity. We talked quietly, sharing books and observations, and as the afternoon wore on, I became increasingly aware of the small intimacies developing between us. The way David would lean closer when I read aloud, close enough that his shoulder pressed against mine. The way our hands would brush when we exchanged books, and how neither of us pulled away as quickly as we once had. The way he'd started looking at me when he thought I was absorbed in reading. I'd caught him several times, and instead of looking away embarrassed, he'd simply smiled. At one point, while I was reading a particularly moving passage from Adrienne Rich, David's hand came to rest on my forearm. It was a gesture of connection, of shared appreciation for the beauty of the words, but it sent electricity shooting through my entire nervous system. "That's beautiful," he said softly when I finished reading, but his hand remained on my arm. "Rich was a master at finding the political in the personal," I managed to say, though I was mostly focused on the warmth of his palm against my skin. "The personal is political," David agreed, and something in his voice made me look up sharply. He was studying my face with an intensity that made my breath catch, especially when it comes to love. The word love seemed to echo in the small space between us. David's thumb moved almost imperceptibly against my forearm, a gesture so small it might have been unconscious, but it sent my heart racing nonetheless. "David," I began, not sure what I wanted to say, but knowing I needed to acknowledge the electricity crackling between us. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." We sat in silence for a moment, his hand still warm on my arm, both of us seemingly afraid to move and break whatever fragile thing was building between us. "This is new for me," David said eventually. "I mean, this." He gestured between us with his free hand. "I've never with someone I met in a library." I laughed softly, understanding what he meant, even if he hadn't quite said it. "The setting is definitely unique." "It's not just the setting," he said, his voice growing more serious. "It's you." Before I could respond, we heard Mrs. Henderson climbing the stairs, her familiar footsteps accompanied by what sounded like a book cart. David's hand slipped from my arm as we both turned toward the sound, and I immediately missed the contact. "5 minutes until closing, you two," Mrs. Henderson called as she appeared at the top of the stairs. "And David, your hold on the new Mary Oliver collection came in." "Thanks, Mrs. H," David replied, and I realized with a start that he'd been coming to this library long enough to be on familiar terms with the staff. After Mrs. Henderson disappeared back down the stairs with her cart, David turned to me with an apologetic smile. "I should grab that book before I forget." "Of course," I said, though I felt the loss of the moment keenly. We packed up our things in comfortable silence, and as we walked down the stairs together, I found myself wondering if I'd imagined the intensity of what had just passed between us. But when David held the door for me as we left the library, his hand briefly touched the small of my back, and I knew I hadn't imagined anything. "Thursday?" he asked as we paused outside the library entrance. "I'll be here," I promised, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything. Thursday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October afternoon that made you want to curl up somewhere warm with a good book and a cup of tea. I climbed the library stairs with anticipation thrumming through my veins, wondering if David and I would pick up where we'd left off on Tuesday. The poetry section was empty when I arrived, but I'd barely settled into my corner chair when I heard David's familiar footsteps on the stairs. My heart did its now customary somersault as he appeared, shaking raindrops from his dark hair. "Wet out there," he observed, unwinding a navy blue scarf from around his neck. "Perfect library weather," I replied, watching as he hung his jacket on the back of a chair and pushed up the sleeves of his gray sweater. There was something almost domestic about the gesture, and it made something warm unfurl in my chest. David settled into the chair beside me, close enough that I could smell the rain in his hair and see the way the damp had made his sweater cling slightly to his chest. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his bag and pulling out a small paperback. "It's a collection by a local poet, someone who gives readings at the community college sometimes. I thought you might like her work." He handed me the book, and as I took it, our fingers lingered together for a moment longer than necessary. The collection was titled Weather Patterns, and the cover featured a watercolor painting of storm clouds over a wheat field. "Did you paint this?" I asked, recognizing something in the style. David's cheeks flushed slightly. "How did you know?" "The brushwork, and the way you handle light. It reminds me of how you talk about poetry, like you're trying to capture something ephemeral." His smile was soft and pleased. I've never had anyone make that connection before. I opened the book to find an inscription on the title page. "For Marcus, who understands that art is about finding beauty in unexpected places." D. "Thank you," I said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "This means a lot." "I was hoping you'd say that." We spent the next hour reading together, sometimes sharing passages aloud, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence. I found myself stealing glances at David as he read, noting the way he'd unconsciously bite his lower lip when he encountered a particularly striking image, the way his eyes would widen slightly when a poem surprised him. At one point, while I was absorbed in one of the local poet's pieces about autumn rain, I felt David's gaze on me. When I looked up, he was watching me with an expression so tender it made my chest tighten. "What?" I asked softly. "Just this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "You here, sharing this with me. It's perfect." I felt heat rise in my cheeks at the sincerity in his voice. "David, I know it's probably too soon to say this," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I look forward to these afternoons all week. More than I should, probably." My heart was beating so hard I was certain he must be able to hear it. "More than you should?" He leaned closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could feel his breath on my cheek. "Because it means I'm falling for you, Marcus. And that's terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected." I felt as though the air had been sucked out of my lungs. David was looking at me with such openness, such vulnerability, that I felt something crack open inside my chest. "It's not too soon," I managed to say, "because I'm falling too." The smile that spread across David's face was like sunrise. He reached out and cupped my cheek with his palm, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Can I?" he began. "Yes," I said, before he could finish the question. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, but pulling away was the last thing on my mind. When his lips finally touched mine, it was soft and sweet and perfect, a first kiss surrounded by thousands of love poems in a place that had become sacred to both of us. When we broke apart, David rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little unsteadily. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Only weeks?" I teased gently. He laughed softly, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Okay, fine. Since the first day I saw you reach for that Mary Oliver collection." "You noticed me before we talked." "Marcus, I noticed you the moment you walked into the poetry section. You moved like you belonged there, like you were coming home." Before I could respond, the sound of the library's closing announcement drifted up from the main floor. David sighed and pulled back reluctantly. To be continued? He asked hopefully. Definitely, I agreed. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, David caught my hand and squeezed it gently. I don't want this to just be about the library anymore, he said. I mean, I love our afternoons here, but... But? I prompted. But I want to know you outside of these walls, too. I want to take you to dinner, show you my studio, introduce you to my friends, if you want that, too. I want that, too, I said, and meant it completely. We walked down the stairs, hand in hand, and as we approached the main entrance, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about this new chapter we were beginning. So, David said as we paused outside the library, dinner tomorrow night? It's a date, I replied, loving the way his face lit up at my words. Perfect. He leaned in and kissed me again, briefly but sweetly, right there on the library steps. I'll pick you up at 7? I'll text you my address, I promised. As I watched David walk away through the drizzle, his scarf wrapped around his neck and his hands tucked into his pockets, I felt a sense of possibility expanding in my chest. Our story was just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead us. The next few weeks passed in a blur of dinners and long walks, of David showing me his studio and introducing me to his artist friends, of me bringing him to graduate student gatherings where he charmed everyone with his thoughtful questions about literature. But we still maintained our Tuesday and Thursday library afternoons because that space had become too important to both of us to give up. It was on a Thursday in early November that things shifted again. David had arrived earlier than usual, and I found him in the poetry section browsing through the new acquisitions shelf that Mrs. Henderson had recently set up. Find anything interesting? I asked, settling into my usual chair. Actually, yes. He turned to me with a grin. Look what just came in. He held up a slim volume with a familiar cover. It was the same local poets collection he'd given me weeks earlier, the one with his watercolor on the cover. They ordered it for the collection, David explained. Mrs. Henderson said it was requested specifically. I felt a flush of pride, both for David and for the poet whose work we'd both grown to love. That's wonderful. It gets better, David said, settling into the chair beside me. She asked if I'd be interested in doing more cover art for local authors. Apparently, the library is starting a partnership with a community college to promote regional artists. David, that's amazing! I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. You must be thrilled. I am, he agreed. But there was something else in his expression, a nervousness that I couldn't quite read. But, I prompted. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at our joined hands. It would mean spending more time here, a lot more time, working with Mrs. Henderson, meeting with authors, maybe even giving some talks about the intersection of visual art and literature. That sounds incredible, I said, still not understanding his hesitation. It is incredible, David agreed. But I keep thinking, what if you get tired of seeing me here so much? This place has been yours for longer than it's been ours, and I don't want to intrude on that. I stared at him, amazed that someone so wonderful could have such doubts. David, you're not intruding. You belong here just as much as I do. Maybe more, considering you've apparently been coming here long enough to be on a first-name basis with Mrs. Henderson. He laughed softly. I've been coming here since I moved to town 3 years ago. It was the first place that felt like home. For me, too, I said. And having you here, it makes it even more like home. David's smile was radiant. In that case, I have something else to tell you. Oh? Mrs. Henderson asked if I knew anyone who might be interested in helping with the library's new poetry workshop series. Someone with academic experience who could help guide discussions about contemporary work. I felt excitement bubble up in my chest. She asked about me? I may have mentioned that I know someone who's brilliant at helping people understand poetry, someone who has this gift for making literature feel accessible and alive. David, I began, overwhelmed by his faith in me. The workshops would be Saturday mornings and they'd pay a small stipend, he continued. I know you're busy with your thesis, but I thought maybe we could do this together, you leading discussions, me creating visual responses to the poems, making art together in the place where we met. I looked around the poetry section, at the shelves that had become so familiar, at the corner where we'd shared so many quiet afternoons, at the windows that had framed our growing connection, and felt a sense of rightness settle over me. "I'd love that," I said. "I'd love all of it." David leaned over and kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When we broke apart, he rested his hand against my cheek, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone. "I love you," he said quietly, and the words seemed to echo among all the poems surrounding us. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the late afternoon light slant through the windows. I thought about all the afternoons that had led to this moment, the awkward first encounters, the gradually deepening conversations, the moment when attraction had blossomed into something deeper. "Can I ask you something?" David said eventually. "Anything." "That first day when we both reached for the Mary Oliver, did you feel it then? The connection?" I considered the question seriously. "I felt something, recognition maybe, like you were someone I was meant to meet." "I felt it too," David said. "I've never believed in fate or destiny or any of that, but standing there in this section, seeing you reach for the same book I wanted, it felt like the universe was trying to tell us something." "Maybe it was," I agreed. "Maybe it was saying that some of the best things in life happen when you least expect them, in the quietest places." David smiled and squeezed my hand. I liked that interpretation. As Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up the stairs with a 15-minute warning, I realized that our time in this phase of our relationship, the phase of stolen moments and nervous anticipation, was coming to an end. We were moving into something deeper, more integrated, more real. Part 2. I was gathering my books, preparing for what I expected would be our usual polite goodbye, when David's voice stopped me mid-motion. The words hung in the air between us like dust motes caught in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "You're here a lot. Maybe next time we could get coffee instead of just the same book." My heart stumbled, then began beating with a rhythm that felt entirely new. I looked up from the volume of contemporary poetry I'd been holding, meeting his eyes directly for what felt like the first time in weeks of carefully managed glances. There was something different in his expression, a vulnerability, yes, but also a quiet certainty that made my chest tighten with possibility. "Coffee?" I repeated, as if the word were foreign, though what I really meant was, "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" David's smile was soft, tentative, but unmistakably hopeful. "There's a place just down the street from here, Cafe Luna. They have these armchairs by the windows that remind me a little of this corner." He gestured to our usual spot, where the golden afternoon light was beginning to deepen toward evening. "Unless you'd rather stick to our library meetings." I don't want to presume anything. The careful politeness of his words couldn't quite mask the nervous energy I could see in the way his fingers drummed against the spine of the book he was holding. Neruda again, I noticed. The same collection he'd reached for that first day when our hands had brushed in what now felt like a lifetime ago. "No," I said quickly, then caught myself. "I mean, yes, to coffee, not to sticking to just the library meetings." I felt heat rise in my cheeks at my clumsy response, but David's smile only grew warmer. "Good," he said simply, and there was something in the way he said it, relief maybe, or quiet joy, that made me realize he'd been as nervous about asking as I was about answering. Mrs. Henderson's footsteps echoed on the stairs again, accompanied by her gentle reminder that the library would be closing in 10 minutes. Usually this announcement would send us into the familiar dance of reluctant goodbyes, of see you Tuesday or see you Thursday, of lingering just a moment too long before finally heading in opposite directions. But today David stepped closer instead of away. "Should we?" he asked, nodding toward the stairs. "We should," I agreed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, breathier than usual, full of anticipation I was trying and failing to contain. We walked down the creaking wooden stairs together, closer than we usually did, close enough that I could catch the scent of his cologne, something clean and subtle that made me think of rain and cedar, close enough that when he shifted his bag to his other shoulder, His arm brushed against mine, sending a small shock of awareness through me. Mrs. Henderson smiled at us from behind the circulation desk as we passed. "See you both next week," she said, and I wondered if she'd noticed the shift in our usual dynamic, the way we were walking in sync now instead of in the careful parallel lines we'd maintained for weeks. "Have a good evening, Mrs. H," David replied, and I was struck again by how easily he moved through the world, how comfortable he seemed with the small intimacies of daily interaction. The late October air hit us as we stepped outside, crisp and clean with the promise of rain. The sun was sitting low behind a bank of gathering clouds, casting everything in that particular golden light that photographers call magic hour. David paused for a moment on the library steps, looking up at the sky with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Looks like weather's coming in," he observed. I followed his gaze, noting the way the clouds were building in the west, dark and heavy with moisture. "Should we make a run for it?" "Cafe Luna is just 2 blocks," David said. "We can probably beat the rain." But as we started walking down Elm Street, I found myself hoping we wouldn't. There was something perfect about this moment, the anticipation of the storm, the golden light slanting between the buildings, the fact that for the first time in 2 months, David and I were walking somewhere together instead of apart. "I have to confess something," David said as we turned the corner onto Main Street. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, and he was looking straight ahead rather than at me as if the confession required all his concentration. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the way my pulse had quickened. "I've been working up the courage to ask you that for 3 weeks." I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. 3 weeks? Ever since the day we both reached for the Ginsberg collection and you read from Howl, there was something about the way you read it, the way the words sounded in your voice. He trailed off, finally glancing at me with a slightly embarrassed expression. "I know that sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't sound ridiculous at all," I said, meaning it completely. "Actually, it sounds—" I searched for the right word. "Nice, really nice." We walked in comfortable silence for a moment, and I found myself marveling at how easy this felt. The rhythm of our steps matching naturally, the way the conversation flowed without effort, as if we'd walked together hundreds of times before instead of never. "Can I confess something too?" I asked as we approached the intersection of Main and 3rd. "Please." "I've been hoping you would ask." The words came out in a rush, and I felt my cheeks warm despite the cool air. "Not that I was brave enough to ask you myself, but I've been hoping." David stopped walking so suddenly that I had to turn back to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk with an expression of such genuine surprise and pleasure that it made something flutter in my chest. "Really?" he asked. "Really," I confirmed. His smile was radiant. Here I was thinking I was being too forward, moving too fast. "You weren't," I assured him. "You're not." The first drops of rain began to fall as we reached the next block, fat and heavy with the promise of more to come. David looked up at the darkening sky, then at me, his expression shifting to something more practical. "We should probably—" he began. But before he could finish, the sky opened up in earnest, releasing the kind of sudden downpour that October seemed to specialize in. Within seconds, we were both soaked, rain streaming down our faces and plastering our hair to our heads. David laughed, a sound of pure delight that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. "So much for beating the weather," he said, pulling a compact umbrella from his jacket pocket. "Here, come here." I stepped closer as he opened the umbrella, and suddenly we were sharing the small circle of dry space beneath its dark canopy. The proximity was startling. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, could smell the rain mixing with his cologne to create something entirely new. "Better," he said softly, and I wasn't sure if he meant the shelter from the rain or our sudden closeness. "Much better," I agreed, though my voice came out slightly hoarse. We walked the remaining block to Cafe Luna, huddled together beneath the umbrella, our shoulders pressed together, our steps carefully coordinated to stay within the small dome of protection. Every few steps, one of us would shift slightly, and I would feel the brush of his jacket against mine, the warmth of his arm through the damp fabric of my sweater. By the time we reached the coffee shop, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the umbrella and cascading off the edges in small waterfalls. David pushed open the glass door and gestured for me to go first, shaking the rain from the umbrella before following me inside. Cafe Luna was exactly what I'd expected from David's description. Warm and softly lit with mismatched furniture that managed to feel cozy rather than chaotic. The air was rich with the scent of coffee and something sweet, cinnamon rolls maybe, or apple turnovers. Jazz music played quietly in the background, and nearly every table was occupied by people seeking refuge from the sudden storm. "There," David said, pointing to a pair of worn leather armchairs near the front windows. "Our timing is perfect." We claimed the chairs just as their previous occupants were leaving, settling in with the satisfaction of having found the best seats in the house. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see Elm Street transformed into something almost magical. The streetlights reflected in puddles, the few pedestrians hurrying past with their heads bent against the weather, the trees swaying in the wind. "What can I get you?" David asked, already pulling off his damp jacket. "You don't have to. I invited you," he said simply. "What sounds good?" I looked around the cafe, taking in the chalkboard menu behind the counter, the glass case filled with pastries and sandwiches, the easy atmosphere of people settling in to wait out the storm. "Surprise me," I said finally. "Something warm." David's smile was soft and pleased. "I can work with that." I watched him walk to the counter, noting the easy way he moved through the space, the genuine smile he gave the barista, the careful attention he paid to whatever recommendation she was offering. When he returned a few minutes later, he was carrying 2 large mugs and a small plate. "Chai lattes," he announced, setting one mug in front of me. "And they had these amazing-looking scones, so I got one to share. Hope that's okay." "It's perfect," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. The chai was fragrant with cardamom and cinnamon, warming me from the inside out. David settled back into his chair, cradling his own mug, and for a moment we simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the rain streak down the windows and listening to the gentle hum of conversation around us. "This is nice," I said eventually. "It is," David agreed. "Different from the library? Good different? Very good different." He took a sip of his chai, then looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Though I have to say I'm going to miss our poetry section meetings." "Who says we have to miss them?" I asked. "Maybe we can do both, library afternoons and coffee shop conversations." David's face lit up. "I'd like that. A lot." We fell into conversation easily the way we had in the library, but with a new openness that came from being in a space that was entirely ours. David told me about his morning painting classes, about the community college students who surprised him with their creativity and insight. I found myself sharing stories about my graduate work, about the professors who challenged me in the papers I was writing. "What drew you to contemporary poetry specifically?" David asked, breaking off a piece of the cranberry scone and offering it to me. "I think it's the immediacy of it," I said, considering the question seriously. "Contemporary poets are writing about the world we're living in right now in language that feels alive and urgent. There's something powerful about reading a poem that could have been written yesterday about your own experience." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's how I feel about painting sometimes. Like I'm trying to capture not just what I see, but what it feels like to be alive in this particular moment." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward in my enthusiasm. "Art as witness, as documentation of what it means to be human right now." "You should meet some of my students," David said. "They have that same passion, that sense that making art matters in a fundamental way." "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. "I'd like to meet the people who are important to you." Something shifted in David's expression at my words, a deepening, a recognition of the intimacy implied in what I'd said. "I'd like you to meet them too," he said quietly. The rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy around our small table. Other conversations faded into background noise, and I found myself focusing entirely on David, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his art, the careful way he listened when I spoke, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when our conversation took an unexpected turn. "Can I ask you something that's been puzzling me?" David said, setting down his mug. "Of course. The Mary Oliver collection. We kept reaching for the same one week after week. Did you actually want to check it out, or were you just—" He trailed off, looking suddenly uncertain. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "You noticed that?" Hard not to notice when someone keeps reaching for the same book they never actually take home. I laughed, embarrassed, but somehow relieved to have been found out. I checked it out the first week, actually, read it cover to cover that same night. But then I kept coming back to it because— I paused, trying to find a way to explain without revealing too much too soon. "Because," David prompted gently, "because it seemed important to you, and I wanted to understand what you saw in it, what kept drawing you back." I met his eyes across the small table between us. "I guess I was curious about you." David's smile was soft and wondering. "I was curious about you too. That's why I kept reaching for it even after I'd memorized half the poems." "You memorized them?" "Some of them, the ones that reminded me of you." The words hung between us, loaded with a significance that made my heart race. There was something in David's expression, a vulnerability, an openness, that made me feel as though we were standing at the edge of something important. "Which ones?" I asked quietly. David was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the surface of the table. Then he looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "The summer day," he said. "Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon?" I recognized the lines immediately, could hear them in David's voice even though he'd spoken them quietly. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" "That one," David said. "Every time I saw you in that corner reading in the afternoon light, I thought about that line, about precious lives and wild choices, and—" he gestured helplessly. "About courage, I guess." "Courage? To ask you for coffee, to risk changing something that was already good on the chance that it might become something extraordinary." I felt my breath catch at the honesty in his words. Around us, the cafe continued its gentle hum of activity, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversation, the soft jazz that seemed to create a soundtrack for the rain outside. But in our corner, time seemed suspended, charged with possibility. "I'm glad you took the risk," I said. "Are you?" "Yes," I said simply. "Very glad." David reached across the table then, his fingers finding mine where they rested beside my mug. The contact was warm and sure, yeah, and I felt something settle into place inside my chest, a recognition, a rightness I hadn't even known I was looking for. "I have another confession," David said, his thumb tracing gently across my knuckles. "I'm beginning to think you're full of confessions," he laughed softly. "Just with you, apparently. You make me want to be honest about things I usually keep to myself." "What's the confession?" "I've been coming to the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 3 years, but I only started lingering in the poetry section after I saw you there that first time." I stared at him, processing this information. "You changed your whole routine because of me?" "Not the whole routine, just expanded it. Poetry was never really my section before. I was more of a browse the new releases, grab a novel and go kind of person." "What changed?" David's smile was self-deprecating. "I saw you reading in that corner, completely absorbed, like the rest of the world had disappeared, and I thought, I want to know what could hold someone's attention like that. I want to understand what makes someone look that content, that at peace." "So you started reading poetry." "I started reading poetry, and I discovered that you were right. There is something magical about being surrounded by all those voices, all those different ways of seeing the world." His grip on my hand tightened slightly. "But mostly I discovered that I wanted to be wherever you were." The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, and the afternoon light filtering through the windows had shifted from gold to the deep amber of approaching evening. Around us, the cafe had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a place where people come to escape the weather and find warmth. "I should probably tell you," I said, emboldened by David's honesty, That I started timing my library visits based on when I thought you might be there. David's eyebrows rose. Really? Really? I may have asked Mrs. Henderson very casual questions about the regular patrons, just to see if she'd mention a certain tall man who always seemed to be browsing the philosophy section. What did she say? That you were one of her favorite regulars, that you'd been coming in for years and always asked thoughtful questions about the new acquisitions. I smiled at the memory. She also mentioned that you had started spending a lot more time in poetry lately, which she thought was wonderful because not enough people appreciated good poetry. David laughed, shaking his head. Mrs. Henderson is very observant. She is. I think she knew we were circling each other before we did. Probably, David agreed. Librarians see everything. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still linked across the table, watching the world outside blur and shift behind the rain-streaked windows. There was something profound about this moment, the crossing from the careful dance we'd been doing for weeks into something more direct, more honest. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything." "What happens now? I mean, after coffee, after we go back to our separate lives? Do we pretend this didn't happen when we see each other at the library next week?" David's expression grew serious, thoughtful. "Do you want to pretend this didn't happen?" "No," I said immediately. "Not at all." "Good, because neither do I." He lifted our joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles that sent warmth shooting up my arm. "I was thinking, maybe next Tuesday, instead of meeting at the library, I could show you my studio, if you're interested." "I'm interested," I said, probably too quickly. "And maybe dinner after? There's a place I've been wanting to try." "David?" "Yeah? You don't have to plan everything right now. We have time." His smile was soft and relieved. "You're right. I'm getting ahead of myself." "It's okay. It's nice, actually, knowing you're thinking about next times." "There are going to be a lot of next times," David said with quiet certainty. "If you want there to be." "I want there to be," I assured him. The barista announced that they'd be closing in 15 minutes, her voice carrying across the cafe and breaking the spell of intimacy that had surrounded our table. I looked around, surprised to find that most of the other customers had left while we'd been talking, leaving just a few die-hard coffee drinkers and us. "We should probably go," David said, though he made no move to release my hand. "Probably," I agreed, equally reluctant to end this moment. But eventually we gathered our still-damp jackets and prepared to face the world outside. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming under the streetlights that had begun to flicker on in the gathering dusk. "Which way are you parked?" David asked as we paused outside the cafe. "Actually, I walked from campus. My apartment is only about 6 blocks from here. I can give you a ride if you want, or walk with you. I'm parked just around the corner." I considered the offer, tempted by the prospect of extending our time together even a little longer, but there was something to be said for ending this first coffee date on the perfect note it had already reached. "I think I'll walk," I said. "It's beautiful out now and I could use the time to think about everything that just happened." David nodded, understanding flickering in his expression. "Good thoughts, I hope." "Very good thoughts, Ashidei," I assured him. We stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye, both aware that we were crossing from one phase of whatever this was into another. The air between us felt charged with possibility, with the recognition that something significant had shifted. "Marcus," David said quietly. "Yeah?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool evening air. "Thank you," he said, "for saying yes to coffee, for taking the chance." "Thank you for asking," I replied, "for being brave enough to suggest it." David smiled, reaching up to touch my cheek with gentle fingers. "I'll see you next time," he said softly. "But maybe we'll skip the library." The word sent a thrill through me, the promise of something new, something that existed outside the familiar boundaries we'd established over the past 2 months, something that was entirely ours. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. David leaned in then and kissed me, soft and sweet and perfect there on the sidewalk outside Cafe Luna. It was a kiss that tasted like chai and possibility, like rain and new beginnings. When we broke apart, both of us were smiling. "Tuesday?" he asked. "Tuesday," I confirmed. I watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets and a lightness in his step that matched the feeling in my chest. Then I turned and began my own walk home, the wet pavement gleaming under the streetlights and the whole world feeling fresh and full of promise. As I walked, I found myself thinking about Mary Oliver's words, the ones David had quoted in the cafe, about wild and precious lives, about courage and choice and the beautiful unpredictability of human connection. 6 hours ago, I'd been preparing for another quiet afternoon in the poetry section of the library. Now I was walking home from my first date with someone who might just change everything. The rain had washed the air clean, and every breath felt like a small celebration. Behind me, the lights of Cafe Luna glowed warm and inviting, a beacon for other people seeking shelter from storms both literal and metaphorical. Ahead of me, my apartment waited, and beyond that, Tuesday and David's studio and all the conversations and discoveries that lay waiting in the days to come. I pulled my phone from my pocket and found David's contact information, saved from when we'd exchanged numbers weeks ago but never used for anything more than confirming library schedules. Now I typed a simple message: "Thank you for coffee. Can't wait for Tuesday." His reply came almost immediately: "Thank you for saying yes. Sweet dreams, Marcus." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking home through the rain-washed streets, carrying the warmth of his words and the promise of Tuesday with me into the night. E.